My daughter-in-law put something in my coffee the morning she tried to kill me. I didn't know that yet. I was standing on the dock, watching the morning fog lift off Lake Crescent, thinking it was the most peaceful I'd felt in years. My son was somewhere behind me, loading the canoe. She handed me the mug with both hands and smiled. That smile. I've been trying to understand that smile ever since. My name is Norman Ashfield. I'm 67 years old. I spent 35 years as a civil engineer for the state of Oregon, designing drainage systems and retaining walls for mountain highways, the kind of infrastructure nobody notices until it fails. I know exactly how things fail. I know the signs, the microfractures, the stress points, the places where the load becomes too great and the whole structure gives way without warning. I missed every single sign in my own family. I want to be honest with you about something before I go any further. I'm telling you this story from a rented room above a hardware store in a small town in Idaho. My right wrist is in a brace. My knee sounds like gravel in a tin can when I walk. I have not slept more than 3 hours at a stretch in 8 days. And the reason I'm recording this instead of going to the police is because the police have already been told I'm dead. If this reaches you, it means I made it. It means everything I spent the last week planning actually worked, but I need you to understand what it cost first. 3 weeks ago, my son called me about a fishing trip. Just us two and my daughter-in-law, he said. Up at the cabin I'd built with my own hands on the north shore of Lake Crescent back in 1998. He said he wanted to reconnect. He said the distance between us had been eating at him. His exact words. The distance has been eating at me, Dad. I should have asked which kind of distance he meant. My son's name is Philip. He's 39. He has my jawline and his mother's eyes and a gambling problem I didn't know the full extent of until I started going through his laptop in the middle of the night with a fractured wrist and a headlamp I found in the emergency kit I'd built into the cabin wall in 2003. His wife's name is Delia. She is 34. She has a real estate license she never uses, a yoga practice she photographs obsessively, and a way of speaking to older people that sounds like warmth but feels like condescension if you pay attention. I didn't pay attention. I paid her student loans instead, $42,000, 2 years ago. I told Philip it was a gift. I told myself it was an investment in their future. The morning she handed me the coffee, I noticed it tasted wrong. Slightly bitter underneath the cream. I set it down on the dock railing and forgot about it. I was watching an osprey work a thermal above the tree line. I was thinking about my late wife, Marion, who loved this lake more than any place on earth. I was thinking how she would have turned 65 that week. I didn't think about the coffee again until I was underwater. We went out in the canoe around 2 in the afternoon. The lake was glass flat, the way it gets in late October when the tourist season is done and the whole shoreline goes quiet. Philip was paddling in front. Delia was in the middle, facing me. I was in the stern with the fishing rod across my knees. She leaned forward to adjust something in the gear bag between her feet. I remember thinking that was odd because she'd never shown any interest in the fishing gear. Then Philip set his paddle across the gunwales and stood up. I started to say something about weight distribution. It's what you do when you've spent your whole life thinking about load and balance. You see a man stand in a canoe in the middle of a lake and your brain automatically calculates the center of gravity and the coefficient of... He turned around. The look on his face was not the look of a man who'd made a clumsy mistake. It was focused, deliberate. He had both hands gripping the gunwale and he was already shifting his weight to the right side with a very specific and practiced intention. The canoe flipped in under a second. The cold hit me like a wall. Lake Crescent in late October runs about 47 degrees. I've read about cold water shock before in safety manuals for trail crews. I knew exactly what was happening to my body as my lungs seized and my muscles locked, and the world became a spinning green darkness. The involuntary gasp reflex almost filled my lungs with water. I got my mouth shut just in time. I'm a decent swimmer. I was a strong swimmer in my 40s. At 67, with a knee that needed replacing and clothes and boots dragging me down, decent was barely enough. I came up about 15 feet from the overturned canoe, gasping, already feeling the numbness spreading from my feet upward. I looked for Philip. I looked for Delia. They were both at the surface. Neither of them was swimming toward me. Philip was gripping the hull of the canoe. Delia was treading water beside him, watching me with an expression I can only describe as clinical, like a person watching an experiment reach its expected conclusion. Help. My voice came out thin and strange in the cold air. The sound embarrassed me even in that moment. Philip, I went under again. The current near the northern shelf is stronger than it looks. I knew that. I'd mapped it. I'd warned Marion about it a dozen times. Now it had me. I don't know how long I was under. The cold was doing something to my sense of time. I was aware of the rock shelf about 8 feet down, and I used it. I pushed off and came up maybe 30 feet further along the shore, closer to the boulder outcropping where the old dock post had rotted out years ago. I grabbed the submerged timber. It held. I got my head up and I coughed until I thought my ribs would break. I pressed myself against the rocks, using them for cover, and I looked back toward the overturned canoe. They were talking. Delia had her hand on Philip's arm. He was nodding at something she was saying. Neither of them was looking at the water where I'd gone under. And then Philip started to cry. It wasn't the crying of a man watching his father drown. It had no searching quality to it, no desperation. It had no searching quality to it, no desperation. He pressed his fist against his mouth and made the right shapes with his face. Delia put her arm around him and began slowly, steadily, paddling them both toward shore. Toward my cabin. Toward my phone, my truck, my keys, my safe. Don't make a sound. Something in my brain said. It was not a gentle thought. It was cold and hard, and it came from a place I didn't know I had. I stayed in the water against the rocks for what felt like 20 minutes. The numbness was past my hips. I was shaking so hard my teeth were clicking together. But I didn't call out. I watched Philip drag the canoe up the beach. I watched Delia walk up the cabin steps without looking back. I watched my son sit down on the dock with his face in his hands, doing the math on whether the body would surface before the paperwork cleared. I got out of the water on the far side of the boulder shelf, where the tree line comes down to within 6 feet of the shore. I crawled on my hands and knees up the embankment. My right wrist had hit something on the way down and was already swollen to the size of a tennis ball. My knee was a grinding shriek with every movement. I pulled myself up behind a cedar that was wide enough to hide behind, and I sat there for a long time, shaking, listening to the sound of my son's voice carrying across the water. He was on his phone. I couldn't hear the words yet, but the tone was unmistakable. Controlled grief. Performing for whoever was on the other end. The performance was good. I would have believed it if I hadn't just watched the setup. I had a problem. My phone was at the bottom of Lake Crescent. My truck keys were inside the cabin, 30 feet from where Delia was probably already going through my desk. My nearest neighbor was a retired schoolteacher named Agnes who lived 2 miles up the logging road, and she was in Phoenix for the winter. The ranger station was 11 miles east, but I had built this cabin. And I had built it the way I'd built everything, with contingencies. Behind the cabin, under the back deck, there's a steel box sunk into a concrete pad. I'd poured the pad myself in 2004, during a stretch of anxiety I'd had after Marion's first cancer scare. It holds a sealed emergency kit, headlamp, first aid, emergency blanket, a handheld radio on the Forest Service frequency, 2 days of food, and a small amount of cash. Marion had teased me about it mercilessly. She called it my bunker starter kit. I needed to get to that box without being seen from inside the cabin. The back wall of the cabin has 2 windows. The kitchen window faces east. The bathroom has a frosted window facing north. If I approached from the southwest, staying below the deck line, I'd be in the blind spot of both. I spent 45 minutes covering 200 feet of ground, in the dark. on a knee that sounded like it was full of broken glass. When I got to the box and got it open, I sat there in the dark under the deck and pressed my forehead against the cold steel lid and didn't move for a while. Above me, I could hear their footsteps on the floorboards. I could hear the specific creak of the third board from the hallway closet that I'd been meaning to fix for 6 years. I could hear Delia's voice, calm and measured, and underneath it, Philip's lower register, still performing for someone on the phone. I put on the emergency blanket. I wrapped my wrist. I ate one of the protein bars without tasting it. Then I turned on the radio and switched it to Channel 7, which is the non-emergency frequency that the Clallam County forestry crews used to use when I was doing contract work on the Olympic Peninsula 20 years ago. It was a long shot. It wasn't a long shot. His name is Gerald. He's 58, a forestry technician I'd worked with on a culvert replacement project back in 2005. He's the kind of man who still carries a paper logbook and considers reliability a moral virtue. When I said my name into that handset, there was a pause. And then he said, "Norman? What the hell? I just saw your son talking to the sheriff's dispatcher." "Tell me exactly what he said," I told Gerald. "He said there'd been a boating accident. He said I'd gone into the water and he hadn't been able to get to me in time. He said he'd searched for 2 hours. His voice kept breaking. Gerald told me, real bad shape." I was quiet for a moment. "Gerald," I said, "I'm alive. I'm under my own back deck. And my son just tried to drown me." The silence that followed was the kind that happens when a person's worldview cracks down the middle and they have to decide in real time which half to stand on. "He's a good man, Gerald. He chose the right half. I need you to do something for me," I told him. "And I need you to not call 911. His response was about what you'd expect from a man who spent 2 decades doing government work in the wilderness. He said, "Tell me what you need." Here is what I knew at that point. Philip had called the sheriff's dispatch. Within hours, there would be a search. Within a day or two, given the lake's depth and temperature, there would likely be a presumption of drowning. Given that presumption, given that I had no will on file that either of them knew about, the default estate process would begin. My cabin, my truck, my pension, my life insurance policy, which I'd taken out in 2019 for $800,000, with Philip listed as sole beneficiary. What I didn't know yet was why. Philip had a decent job in commercial property management. He lived in a nice house in Tacoma. He and Delia weren't wealthy, but they weren't desperate. Or so I'd thought. I needed to understand the why before I decided anything else. After dark, when I heard them settle in for the night, I went through the basement entrance. My cabin has a root cellar dug under the original structure, accessible from outside through a slanted storm door behind the woodpile. Philip had never once, in 39 years, shown any interest in where I kept the storm door key. Inside the root cellar, there's an access hatch in the ceiling that opens into the utility closet. From the utility closet, you can hear everything that happens in the main room. I discovered this acoustic quirk in 2001. And had never gotten around to insulating the floor properly. I lay on the cold dirt floor of that root cellar for 3 hours with my ear to the ceiling, and I listened to my son and his wife dismantle my life. The numbers were the first thing. Philip owed $340,000, not to a bank, to a man named Terrence who ran a private lending operation out of Spokane that described itself as a real estate investment group but functioned primarily as a mechanism for extracting money from desperate people at 30% monthly interest. Philip had borrowed initially to cover losses from a failed development deal. He'd borrowed again to cover the interest. Then again. The hole had no bottom. Terrence's people had visited their house in Tacoma 3 weeks ago. They had left a photograph on the kitchen table. It was a photograph of my cabin. Delia was the one talking through the logistics. She had a voice that stayed even when she was discussing catastrophic things. The same voice she'd used when she told me over Easter dinner 2 years ago that she'd decided not to have children. Matter of fact, resolved. She said the insurance payout would cover the debt to Terrence with roughly $400,000 left over. She said the cabin could be listed as soon as the estate cleared, which a lawyer she knew in Seattle could expedite. She said the most important thing was that the sheriff needed to find something in the water within the next 48 hours, even if it was just my jacket, to establish evidence of drowning. Philip said very little. He made a sound twice that might have been crying. Delia talked over both of them. Then she said something that stopped the blood in my veins. She said, "And Philip's sister doesn't know about any of this, right? I have a daughter. Her name is Ruth. She's 34. She teaches second grade in Corvallis. She calls me every Sunday without fail and signs her texts with little drawings of whatever she's been reading that week. She has no idea I was at the lake. Philip had specifically asked me not to tell her about the trip. He'd said he wanted it to be a father-son thing. He didn't want her to feel left out, but also didn't want to make it a big group production. I understand now that Ruth's ignorance was load-bearing. She was the variable that could unravel everything if she started asking questions too soon. Delia said, "She needs to stay in the dark until the claim processes." Philip said, "She's going to be destroyed." There was a pause. Then Delia said very quietly, "She'll be fine. People survive losing parents." I lay in the dark under my own floor and I thought about my daughter standing at my grave. I thought about her Sunday phone calls going unanswered. I thought about the little drawings in her texts piling up on a dead phone. Something shifted in me then. It wasn't rage exactly. Rage is hot. This was cold. This was the engineering brain taking over from the father brain. The part of me that has spent 40 years looking at broken things and figuring out the exact sequence of interventions required to make them worse. I called Gerald back on the radio. "I need you to make 3 calls, I told him. Not to 911, not to the sheriff. 3 specific calls. I explained what I needed. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he said, "Norman, how's your wrist?" I told him it wasn't good. He said he'd be there by morning. Gerald arrived at 5:15 a.m. in his forestry truck, which he parked a quarter-mile up the logging road and walked in from. He brought painkillers from his own supply, a wrist splint, and a thermos of coffee that I drank in its entirety sitting in the root cellar while he stood watch at the storm door. He also brought confirmation that my 3 calls had been made. The first was to Ruth. Gerald had reached her through her school's emergency contact line and told her only that there had been an incident involving her father at the lake cabin and that she should not contact Philip, should not travel to the lake, and should wait for further contact. He gave her a code phrase I'd chosen, the name of the fishing hole where I'd taught her to cast when she was 8 years old. She'd know it was real. The second call was to my insurance company's fraud division. Not the claims line, the fraud division. Gerald had a contact there from a completely unrelated situation years ago involving a false fire claim on some forestry equipment. He passed along a message that the policy on file for Norman Ashfield should be flagged for review pending a formal statement from the policyholder, who was not, in fact, dead. The third call was to a man named Decker, who had been Philip's supervisor at the commercial property firm 3 years ago, before Philip was let go. I'd had a difficult conversation with Decker at the time, one where he told me more than he probably should have about why Philip was terminated. Decker knew about the gambling. He knew about the specific development deal that had started the spiral. He had records. I told Gerald to tell Decker that I needed everything in writing, notarized, and sent to an attorney in Portland whose name I gave him from memory. That attorney had handled Marion's estate. She was one of the sharpest people I had ever met, and she owed me nothing, which meant she would do exactly what I paid her to do without sentiment getting in the way. Philip and Delia came outside at around 9 in the morning. I was back under the deck by then, watching through a gap in the lattice boards. There was a sheriff's deputy with them. Young, maybe 25. He was nodding and making notes. Delia was in a fleece vest and hiking boots, and she had arranged her face into something that photographed well as grief. Philip pointed out at the lake and said something. The deputy nodded again. I watched him walk back to his cruiser and radio something in. He didn't look at the deck. He didn't look at the woodpile. He didn't look anywhere except at the 2 people who were supposed to be mourning. Later that morning, I heard them talking through the floor about a woman named Sadie. Sadie, it turned out, was the reason Delia had stayed with Philip through all of it. Not loyalty, not love. Sadie was Delia's name for the life she was buying with my death. She and a man named Grant, who was her personal trainer in Tacoma, and had apparently been much more than that for the better part of 2 years, had plans. Portugal, she said. She said Grant had a contact in the Algarve who could set them up with a rental management business. She said she needed the cabin money specifically for that because the insurance payout was going entirely to Terrence's people, and that after that, Philip would be manageable. Manageable. I turned the word over in my head for a long time after that. My son had thrown his father into a lake to pay a debt to a loan shark, and his wife was going to take her share and move to Portugal with a man named Grant, and Philip was going to be left with nothing. He didn't know that yet. He was sitting in my kitchen eating my food and crying on cue for a sheriff's deputy. And he had no idea that the person he trusted with the whole plan had already written him out of the ending. I had a choice to make. I thought about Ruth. I thought about the photograph on the kitchen table in Tacoma showing my cabin. I thought about what kind of father Philip might have been if a different sequence of events had led him here. I thought about the afternoon I taught him to drive a manual transmission in an empty parking lot and how he'd stalled the truck 11 times in a row and laughed so hard he cried. Then I thought about Delia saying, "She'll be fine. People survive losing parents." I thought about Marion and about surviving things and about what it costs. Gerald came back the second night with news that the attorney in Portland had received Decker's materials and was already in contact with the insurance fraud division. He said Ruth was in a hotel in Olympia waiting. He said she had called him 4 times. He also said that Philip had given a full recorded statement to the sheriff that afternoon describing my death. He had cried during the statement. The deputy had patted his shoulder. The will reading, Gerald told me, was scheduled for the following morning at 10. Philip had found a copy of an old will I'd had drawn up in 2015. That will left everything to him. What he didn't know was that I'd had it superseded in 2022, after Marion died, and I'd done a full reassessment of everything in my life that mattered to me. The 2022 will left the cabin to Ruth and divided the liquid assets into a trust for her children. Should she have any, it left Philip $10,000 and a letter. He didn't know about the 2022 will. Almost nobody did. It was filed with the Portland attorney, who was at that moment sitting in a hotel room in Port Angeles. I spent the third night writing. Gerald had brought me a legal pad and 2 pens. My left hand is not my dominant hand, but it was functional. I wrote for 6 hours, working from memory, going through every financial record I could reconstruct, every conversation I'd had with Philip over the past 3 years, every sign I'd missed and the ones I hadn't. I wrote down the things Delia had said through the floor. I wrote down the thing about Portugal and Grant and Sadie. I wrote it all down on 31 pages of yellow legal paper and I signed every page. Then I got ready. The morning of the will reading, I was already inside the cabin. I had gone in through the utility closet at 4 in the morning, when their breathing through the floor told me they were deeply asleep. I'd spent an hour just sitting in the utility closet, listening to the house settle, getting warm for the first time in 3 days. I ate the last of the protein bars. I changed into dry clothes from my own closet, moving in the dark, in a house I'd built, finding everything by feel. I found Philip's phone on the kitchen counter, and I went through it for 20 minutes with the headlamp on low. What I found there I won't describe in detail, except to say that it confirmed everything I'd heard through the floor and added several things I hadn't known, including a series of messages from Delia to a contact labeled simply G that left no ambiguity about her intentions post-settlement. I photographed every screen. Gerald's camera had been in the emergency kit. I also found, in Philip's sent messages, a text to Terrence's number sent the afternoon I went into the water. It said, "It's done. 2 weeks." I put the phone back exactly where I'd found it. Then I went and sat in a chair in the corner of the living room in the dark, and I waited. The attorney arrived at 9:40. Her name is Voss. I've never seen her flustered. She walked through the front door of my cabin, which Philip had opened for her, looking surprised and slightly uncertain, and she set her briefcase on my kitchen table and said, "I'll need everyone seated, please." Philip said, I'm sorry. I don't think we've met. She said, we haven't. I represent the estate of Norman Ashfield. I'll explain everything once we're seated. Delia came in from the kitchen and sat down across from Voss. She was wearing one of my flannel shirts, which she'd apparently borrowed at some point and which I hadn't noticed until that moment, and the sight of it did something cold and precise to my reasoning. Voss opened her briefcase and began laying out documents. She talked about the superseding will. She talked about the 2022 filing date and the notarization and the witnesses. She talked about the insurance fraud flag and the recorded statement from Decker and the fact that the Clam County Sheriff's Office had received at 8 a.m. that morning a package containing 31 pages of handwritten testimony from the allegedly deceased Norman Ashfield, complete with a notarized attestation from a Clallam County forestry technician confirming the date and circumstances of its composition. Philip's face went through several things in about 4 seconds. Delia's face went very still. Voss said, there is also the matter of a living witness. She looked at the utility closet door. I opened it. I've thought about that moment many times since. I've tried to identify the exact thing I felt when I stepped into the light of my own living room and watched my son see me standing there. Vindication isn't the right word. Vindication implies triumph. This wasn't triumph. This was more like standing at the site of a collapse you'd predicted and finding it exactly as bad as you'd feared. I looked worse than I had in the water. 3 days in the root cellar in the woods had done their work. My wrist was visibly wrong. My knee had stiffened so badly I was moving with one leg and using the doorframe as a crutch. I hadn't shaved. I was wearing a flannel shirt over a thermal layer, and I still had dirt under my nails from the embankment. Philip stood up. His chair scraped back. Dad, he said. His voice cracked on the single syllable. He took one step toward me and stopped. I don't know what he saw in my face. Whatever it was, it stopped him. Delia said, this is not possible. I looked at her. I'd known her for 8 years. I'd lent her my copy of a book she'd mentioned once, and she never returned it, and I'd never asked for it back. Small things accumulate. I said, sit down, Delia. She sat down. I wasn't going to perform. I didn't have the energy for a speech. I looked at Philip for a long time. He was shaking. He'd always shaken when he was afraid, since he was small. His hands and his voice, always the first things to go. I said, I know about Terence. I know about Portugal. I know about Grant. I watched Delia's composure leave her face the way water leaves a tipped glass. I said, I know you are going to let him pay the debt and then leave him with nothing. And I need you to understand that I'm not saying this to protect him. I'm saying it because it's the truth, and the truth is the only thing in this room right now. Philip sat back down. Slowly. He was looking at the table. I pulled out the legal pad. I set it on the table beside Voss's documents. I said, 31 pages. Everything you said in this cabin for 3 days. Everything on your phone. The texts to Terence. The messages to Grant. All of it, Voss said without looking up from her papers. The sheriff is outside. He's been outside for 20 minutes. Delia said, I want a lawyer. I said, you have that right. Philip didn't say anything for a very long time. He was looking at his hands. They were still shaking. He looked up once and met my eyes and then looked back down. The thing I saw in that moment, I won't try to describe. Some things aren't language. They're just weight. The sheriff came in and the room changed the way rooms change when the official structure of consequence enters. There were 2 deputies. Boss stood up and handed one of them a folder. I moved to the side and let them do what they've come to do. Delia was arrested first. She walked out with her head very straight and her jaw set, and she didn't look at anyone. Philip stood up when they came to him. He walked over to me. The deputy let him get close. I don't know why. Maybe he could see what it was. Philip said, I'm sorry, Dad. I didn't have an answer for that. I don't think he expected one. The deputy touched his shoulder, and Philip walked out the front door of the cabin I'd built 30 years ago, and the door closed, and it was quiet. Voss closed her briefcase. She said Ruth's outside too. She drove up this morning. I sat down. My knee didn't give me a choice. Ruth came in, and she didn't say anything at all. She just put her arms around me and stayed there for a while, and I let her. She smelled like coffee and cold air, and the specific shampoo she's used since she was 16. She was shaking a little, or maybe I was. After a while, she said, "Can we go home?" I said, "Give me a minute." I got up and walked to the back window and looked out at the lake. It was flat and gray and cold under the October sky. The canoe was still upside down on the dock where Philip had left it. The dock post I'd been meaning to replace for 3 years was still leaning at its 12-degree angle. I'd built this place to last. I'd thought about the load-bearing elements, the drainage, the frost line, the seasonal variation in the shoreline. I'd thought about everything except the people. I have a rule I teach young engineers. I taught it to every crew I ever ran. You don't design for the best-case scenario. You design for the moment when everything that can go wrong has gone wrong simultaneously. And you ask yourself, what is still standing? What holds? I looked at the lake. I thought about Marion. I thought about Ruth with her arms around me. I thought about Gerald on the other end of a radio frequency he probably never expected to use for something like this, choosing without hesitation which have to stand on. Some structures hold, not the ones you built from money, the ones you built from time. I turned away from the window. Ruth was watching me with her hands in her pockets, giving me the room I needed without being asked. She's always known how to do that. "Let's go," I said. We drove out in Voss's car. I didn't look back at the cabin as we went up the logging road. The trees closed behind us, and the lake disappeared, and I let it go. Philip's trial is in the spring. Delia's case has been separated from his. The details of Grant's involvement are still being worked through by people who do that for a living. I don't follow it closely. Voss sends me updates when there's something I need to know. The cabin is listed with an agent in Port Angeles. Ruth asked if I wanted to keep it, and I thought about it honestly for a few days before I told her no. She understood. She always does. I'm staying in Idaho for now. The hardware store below me is owned by a man who doesn't ask questions and makes excellent coffee. My knee is scheduled for surgery in January. My wrist has healed about 80% of the way, and the orthopedist says the rest will come with time. The loan shark Terrence is a matter for other people to handle. The sheriff's office in Spokane is aware of him. I've given them everything I have. I got a letter from the prison last week. Philip's handwriting. I recognized it immediately, the way he still makes his lowercase letter E like a backwards 3, the way he did when he was learning to write. I put it in the drawer with the others. I don't know yet what I'll do with them. That's a question for a version of me that has more distance. I'm working toward that version. Some days are closer than others. What I know now is this. I spent 40 years designing systems to fail safely. To fail in ways that protect people instead of destroying them. The engineer's term for it is graceful degradation. You build in the redundancies. You account for the worst case. You make sure that when the load becomes too great and the structure gives way, the people underneath have somewhere to go. I missed the signs in my own family. I missed them for years, but when the structure finally gave way, I had a root cellar. I had a radio. I had Gerald. I had Ruth. I had a woman in Portland who does her job without sentiment, and a fishing hole my daughter has known the name of since she was 8. That was enough. It was exactly enough. If you're watching this and you've ever looked at someone you love and thought, I would do anything for this person, and wondered if they would do the same, here is what I want to tell you. You already know the answer. You've always known the answer. The work is not in finding out. The work is in what you build after you do. I'm Norman Ashfield, and I am not done yet. Not even close. If this story reached you, leave a comment. Tell me where you're watching from. Tell me if you've ever had to make a choice between what you wished was true and what you knew was true. I read everything. Until next time, stay standing. I've been sitting with this story long enough now to say something honest about it. Not the part about the lake, or the root cellar, or the 31 pages I wrote left-handed by headlamp. That part is just what happened. What I want to talk about is the part underneath it, the part that took me longer to see clearly. Philip didn't become the man who flipped that canoe overnight. Neither did Delia. What I watched happen to my son happened slowly, across years, in small decisions that each seemed survivable on their own. One loan to cover a bad deal. One lie to cover the loan. One larger lie to cover the first. And at some point, the structure of his life became so compromised that he couldn't see a way out that didn't involve destroying the people who loved him. That's not an excuse. It's a description of how people actually fall apart, not in one dramatic moment, but in a long, quiet sequence of choices that each felt, at the time, like the only option available. I missed it because I wasn't looking. I was proud of him in the way fathers get proud, in a way that's really about ourselves as much as our children. I saw what I wanted to see. I lent him money and called it faith. I paid her student loans and called it generosity. What I didn't do was ask the harder questions. What do you actually need? What are you actually afraid of? Are you okay? The real version of okay, not the social version. I'm not blaming myself for what he did. He made those choices. They belong to him. But I also know that intelligence without honesty is just a more sophisticated way of being lost. I had the intelligence to design infrastructure that lasts for decades. I didn't have the honesty to look directly at my own son and ask what was breaking. The thing that saved my life wasn't the emergency kit under the deck, though that helped. It wasn't Gerald, though I owe him more than I can repay. It was the decision, in the coldest moment of the worst night of my life, to think instead of react, to build a plan instead of explode into one. Resilience isn't the absence of fear or pain. It's the decision to keep functioning while you're feeling both. Every hour I spent in that root cellar was an hour I had to choose again, to think clearly instead of giving in to the thing that wanted to just end. Ruth asked me once, about a week after it was all over, whether I regretted anything. I thought about it seriously before I answered. I told her I regretted not having harder conversations earlier. I regretted mistaking comfort for love and money for connection. I regretted that I taught Philip to build things but not to be honest about when something was already broken. The lake is still there. The cabin is listed. Philip's trial is in the spring. And I'm still here, which is the only answer that matters right now. Not because I'm tougher than the water, but because I was honest enough with myself to survive it. That's the only thing I know for certain that I'd tell anyone who's listening. The truth is not the comfortable thing, but it is the only load-bearing material I've ever found that actually holds when everything else gives way. Stay standing.